gentlemen, welcome to the debate on populism and gender backlash, which takes place as a part of the 6th Prague Populism Conference. My name is Andrea. I am the director of the Prague office of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and I have the pleasure to be the host of this panel. Before the debate begins, I would like to say a few words about our reasons for bringing out a book on populism and gender. Last year, our conference, which we have been organizing together with the Lazarski University and the Goethe Institute since 2015, has to be cancelled due to the COVID pandemic. Nevertheless, we decided to collect 7 innovative papers from scholars, most of which have been presented, should have been presented at the last year's conference, and to release them as a published collection. Thus, we are now very pleased to launch the book entitled Current Populism in Europe, Gender-Backlash and Counter-Strategies. While choosing the thematic focus of the book, we decided on the topic of feminism and gender democracy, since it is not only one of the core values of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, but sadly also a very topical and relevant issue if we want to understand today's populism. We don't need to look far. Recent developments in Poland and Hungary are very serious frontal attacks against progressive forces who struggle for gender equality. That is why we chose to include in our publication 2 studies focusing on the situation in both countries, analyzing the mechanisms of how the politics of national governments is undermining women's rights and liberal democracy. I am very glad that the 2 authors accepted our invitation to present and debate their analysis on the panel today. Additionally, the book contains a set of revealing studies which delve deeper into, for instance, the populist communication strategies in Italy, the rise of the radical right party in Spain, or the possibilities of a liberal democratic response to the populist threat. My gratitude and credits go to the editors of the book, our close partners from Lazarski University, Vladimír Handl and Martin Mejstřík, and all the scholars who presented their research findings here. I would also like to thank my predecessor, Nino Ležava, and my colleague from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, Kateřina Boťová, for initiating and preparing this publication. I hope that it finds many interested readers, and I hope that it will provide theorists and practitioners with a more in-depth insight into the complex picture of populism and spark further debates on counter-strategies in Europe. And now I would like to give the floor to Martin Mejstřík, editor of the book, to say a few more opening words. Martin Mejstřík is a lecturer at the Institute of International Studies and Lazarski University in Prague. In his research, he focuses on European populism from a comparative perspective, Italian politics, and on the transformation of communist parties. Martin, the floor is yours.
Adela, thank you very much for a very nice introduction, and actually for a very complex presentation of the content of our volume. Indeed, when we last year, when we got the first notice about the coronavirus situation, we were contemplating about what we should do about the conference. At the end, because it was very new, in spring we didn't know what to expect. And now we are all used to have these type of events with very good technical backup, and we somehow good experience after a whole year being stuck online behind our computers. But then we didn't have that experience, so we decided after very long consideration to cancel our event. However, we didn't want to just leave the void without any activity the whole year and just waiting the pandemic situation to go away. So in this way, after the debate with our colleagues at Heinrich-Böll Foundation and Goethe Institute, we decided to prepare a volume containing several chapters, which, as Adela mentioned, were supposed to be presented at that cancelled conference. since last summer, and especially during autumn, we worked quite extensively on these chapters together with the authors, and obviously with big help from Heinrich-Böll Foundation, especially from my colleague Katerina, and together we put these 7 chapters. When we thought about what should be, because the chapters are quite not like diverse in their looking on the populism as such, when we thought what should we have as a kind of the most important issue coming and emphasizing in this book, we decided that it should be, or it would be very nice to be, if it would be populism and studying how populists are reacting to gender issues, and this what would we call backlash, meaning that how populists are reacting and interacting with other political part actors, and also like non-governmental and other actors who are dealing with gender issues, especially in the Central East European region. And we will have now the debate with our esteemed guests and authors who were writing about the situation in Poland and Hungary mainly, because there the situation is unfortunately pretty much severe regarding also gender issues. So that was the main focus of the book. We started to work on it, and we were able to finish it this spring, and now it's an open access, so we can I can't wave it now in my hand as would, or like Christ in it with some nice champagne, but at least you can download it freely from the website of Heinrich-Böll Foundation in a PDF, and read what chapters you can find interesting. And we can also now use the opportunity of our conference and the final discussion of our conference and go back to this very important issue about populism and gender, and talk about it more thoroughly. So again, thank you also to my colleague Vladimir Handl, who can't be unfortunately here at the beginning of this debate, to our colleagues in Heinrich-Böll Foundation for backing us in this process, and also obviously to all the authors, and especially those who are now with us and will give us their insight in this issue. So I'm now giving floor back to Adela, who will be chairing the following debate.
Thank you, Martin. And now I finally have the pleasure to also welcome our panelists. First, I would like to welcome our very special guest, Andrea Petö. She is professor in the Department of Gender Studies at the Central European University in Vienna, and a Doctor of Science of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, where she chairs the subcommittee on history of the Second World War. Presently, she is working on gendered memory of World War II and political extremisms. Andrea, we are happy to have you here and share your expertise with us. And before we start debating, I would like to give you the opportunity to share with us some of your thoughts on the issue of populism and gender backlash. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this honor to be the first speaker of this very important event. Congratulations to the book, and congratulations to the editors, and also let me praise the Böll Foundation, which actually made this book possible. So in this brief intervention, I would like to emphasize the political importance of this academic publication. And why this was published by a German political foundation and not by any other peer-reviewed journal or publishing house. The recent scholarship recognizes the 3 important problems researching populism. The first one is understanding populism not only as a right-wing populism, but acknowledges its emancipatory potential and its attraction. Secondly, the decolonization of populist research, which reminds us that there are many different types of leaderships, that this can also be a part of a democratic experience, and radically emancipatory dimension of this populist commitment. And decolonizing research also means quoting and referring to works, not only to the works of scholars from the so-called old Europe, but also which are published outside the traditional northern Eastern hemisphere, not only in English, but in other important languages. And the third one is that the gender-blind research, which has been only focusing on male charisma, having long quotes from male leaders, ignoring the feminism, that feminism is also considered as a populist social movement. So these three dimensions are very important in the present research, and the two concepts, gender and populism, have recently been connected in new ways and producing fundamentally new forms of relationality. And this book, which we are celebrating today, is one of the attempts. Analyzing these connections poses various challenges as populism has re-emerged as a viable and electorally popular response to the 2008 triple crisis. Its modus operandi has left academics and politicians baffled ever since, as this is the first time after 1945 that anti-democratic parties have chanced to be elected via democratic methods, and after they have been elected, they fundamentally transform how politics is done. The understanding the people as a political subjectivity, populism implies a break with the previous status quo. To shed a light on this complexity, I argue that the present form of populism is a joint result of the structural failures of the European neoliberal democratic project, this is one, the dark legacy of European modernity, two, and the complexities of the concept of gender. All three are present in the volume in different ways, and all three directions are needed to be analyzed in order to create successful political strategies in the future. And that explains why the Böll Foundation financed this volume. So let's see the first point. First, the populist project would not have been so successful if not for its acute identification of the gendered challenges created by the so-called neoliberal neopatriarchy, represented by powerful female leaders and Sheryl Sandberg's so-called lean in, among others. The neoliberal model of women's emancipation has gained prominence across the Western world and in the last decades. Critical feminists have pointed out the negative effects of neoliberal feminism's market orientation, overemphasis of paid employment's emancipatory aspects, simultaneous ignorance of care work and fetish of choice, and individualism at the expense of aiming for structural changes. As a result of neoliberalization, elite and upper class, women's modernity became very different from ordinary women's modernity. Elite and upper class women benefit from more access to the labor market and can pay for care. For so-called ordinary women, a place in the labor market means not only facing labor segregation, but a gender gap in who performs the majority of the unpaid care work. This is another source of alienation and conflict. And this expressed in labeling others as backward doesn't help, like sometimes those who are voted for populism, they are labeled as backward, but rather provokes critique of the elite and the West. Despite the structural failures of the European neoliberal democratic project, mainstream political science scholarship still presents transitional Eastern Europe uncritically. The overlooking of the structural problems of this modernity not only left mainstream academics and politicians unprepared for the surge of populism, but so far also made gender as a category of analysis invisible. That's why we are celebrating this book today. At the same time, feminist scholars who have been less enthusiastic about the price women pay as far as unemployment, unpaid care work, political leadership positions, a pay gap, and professional segregation were showed that a gender-sensitive approach allows us to track the cracks in this so-called success story of the neoliberal model of representative democracy. It is exactly these cracks that populism detects and uses it to its advantage, such as the populist, welfarist, chauvinist responses to the care crisis. As long as ideas about family and women's and men's role in society constitute a common symbolic space of mainstream right and far-right parties, the endorsement of rhetoric based on traditionalist, complementary, and binary interpretation of gender will enable populist parties to appropriate key elements from right-wing party programs. Under populist governance, women become responsible for all unpaid care and household work, while welfare institutions are rolled back and privatized. At the same time, populist regimes give women recognition for the reproductive and care work. By enhancing the status of care work and recognizing women's contribution to the reproduction of the society, populist parties seize and appropriate the discursive political space, also targeted by feminist resistance towards neoliberalism. Women's political mobilization is tied to their position within the gender division of labor, rather than as theoretical strategic interest. And populist politics is addressing such structural inequalities and offering solutions. Their so-called demographic crisis rhetoric, for instance, has led to the state offering support to non-Roma heterosexual families with stable income and welfare provisions. This process of mobilization without emancipation explains the massive electoral support which is achieved in an illiberal framework in several countries. The second point, the second strand in the chapters, Europe was so focused on its liberal consensus that it turned a blind eye to its own dark legacy. The continuity of exclusionary and marginalizing ideologies and practices, as well as the political violence stemming therefrom. In Eastern Europe, this tradition has been successfully transmitted through family lineages, select social milieus and subcultures, even during the most oppressive communist period. But it re-emerged with vigor after 1989. The dark legacy is also present in academic knowledge production, quoting only male scholars, very rarely women from the global north only. This makes the situation even worse, especially there is a developing scholarship about Eastern Europe and Latin America written by Eastern European and Latin American scholars, which would help us to understand the present situation in different parts of Europe. And the third point is the definition of gender, which is very much multi-layered. And this has caused several problems and internal contradictions within progressive emancipatory politics. Problems and contradictions that were later cunningly and ruthlessly used by illiberal populist forces focused on exploiting already existing cleavages. Gender is a concept, but it's also a political project, a social practice, and a theory. So the concept of gender itself has been used at least 4 different senses in the literature and also in this volume. In the English-speaking context, gender became a substitute for biological sex. However, in some fields, and especially in the field of policy analysis, gender is simply a substitute for women. But gender is also an analytical category describing the social quality of distinctions based on sex, the power structures in a given society between men and women, and the roles, possibilities, and constraints attributed to those born male or female. This is how the definition of gender is understood in the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, the Istanbul Convention. Lastly, gender also means gender identity. A person's felt sense of identity, that this identification vis-a-vis being born male or female. And this issue is not only that the definition of gender has 4 different layers, and none of these layers nor their interrelationships as theory, practice, and project have been previously sufficiently problematized. That's why we are celebrating this book here today. The way gender operates in populist politics remained under the radar of scholarship, including recent feminist works. Certainly, with the proliferation of countries implementing populist policies of governance, the study of populism as a political modus operandi has also developed. That's why we are celebrating this book today, and thank you very much for listening to my 3 points, which are there in the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea, for this complex insight into the issue, and there is much to follow up on in the debate, I'm sure. But first, let's now hear from our 2 guests who contributed to our publication with a paper. First, I would like to give the word to Anna Grudzinska. She is a lecturer at Lazarski University in Poland and also the co-founder of the NGO Foundation for Social Diversity. She obtained her PhD in citizenship and rule of law at the University of Aberdeen, and her research focuses on anti-discrimination, social diversity, and human rights. Anna, please tell us a few words about your chapter carrying the title Make Misogyny Great Again, Anti-Gender Politics in Poland.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, so I think I first will introduce the 3 sections into which I divided my contribution in this volume. And I will also say, maybe to begin with, a few words why I decided to write it in the first place. And the reason why I actually decided to kind of tackle the problem is that I couldn't quite grasp this notion or the idea that gender is the symbolic glue of nationalism and radical right populism. I mean, it was clear to me, I agreed with it, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. That means I was trying to maybe find the molecule that is that makes the glue work, so to speak. So my question was, okay, gender is the symbolic glue, but why actually? And I'm first of all a cultural anthropologist, so I study. So while most of the scholars on this conference are political scientists, and they study more institutions, institutional frameworks, policies. I'm more on the political culture side. So I'm interested more in norms, values, and symbolic codes. So I was really trying to kind of work from that perspective and really look at my sources from that analytical sort of frame. So I was at the center where I did my PhD, we used to talk about political community as basically consisting of three major components. That is the institutional structures and legal structures. That is the first thing. Second thing are the norms, values, and the political culture that kind of guide this institutional framework. And finally, there's also something that the populists call the people or society. So we have these three things that come together in this idea of political community, and this is how probably also many anthropologists or people who work with political culture see it. So it's not only the institutional structures, it's also how society works, what can we see within the civil society framework, and so on and so forth. And I was actually looking, so in my search for the symbolic glue, I was looking at the political culture. So I was trying to figure out what kind of norms, values, structures can we see there, what is the glue actually made of. And I think that what is combining populists, conservatives, the right wing, the far right, alt-right, white supremacy, is this idea of naturalizing social hierarchies. And I think that what makes the glue work is the fact that this is actually, that we can find this particular element in all of these ideologies, structures, and ideas. So I was then trying to kind of figure out how this particularly works in the Polish case. So I divided my paper into three parts. And first, I'm taking a step back. So I analyzed the project of Law and Justice, but that project didn't come out kind of ex nihilo. That is a project that was long in the making. So it was not something that kind of came out of the box as a surprise in 2005, because that was the first government by PiS, nor in 2015, nor in the last election. So that was something that we already had in the Polish politics. And I would say that the problem started really or became visible before the debate or the constitutional debate that we had before 1997, where we could see that there is an actually really existing conflict within Polish society, and that conflict is around norms and values. So it's not something that Law and Justice invented. They actually used differences and structures that are already there, or conflicts that are already existing within Polish society, to construct their political project. And I would say that it performs three functions that I see as crucial. And that speaks to what we were discussing during the conference, because I think we talked during one of the panels about relative deprivation, and that it addresses relative deprivation. And I totally agree with it. But I would also say that it is a project of symbolic validation. And I think Andrea talked about it before, so that it's not only about economic redistribution, but actually the economic redistribution that we see serves also to kind of give a better substance to this symbolic validation. So I think this is a very important element. Second element, which is very often kind of ignored in many analyses on what is going on in Poland at the moment, is the settling of scores among symbolic elites in Polish society. So not political elites, but symbolic elites, which are also divided. And there are many conflicts. And I think the core, and it was already said, the core element that is kind of dividing it is the project of European modernity itself. Recently, there was a volume published in Poland that is called Enlightenment Here and Now, because we are still debating these issues. So there are many conservative politicians in Poland that are of the opinion that the demise of the European project actually started with the French Revolution, right? So that is a kind of discourse that you can hear in Poland. And also this is a part of an anti-European discourse that is very much alive and kicking in Poland. So this struggling with identity, also this idea that the Western project is a colonial, being part of the EU is in a way a sort of a second colonial project in Polish society. And this debate can, some people say these debates go back to 1918. Some people say they are even much, much older than that. So that is a second element that I think one cannot ignore when speaking about what is going on at the moment. And it's also important for the gender aspects of it. And finally, it's the project of law and justice. It's not only a political project. It's not only a project for political parties or of setting or creating a new political community, but it is also a project that targets or has the aim of creating a new society. So when you look at the 2003 text of the Constitutional Convention of Peace that they organized back in 2003 and analyze that text, you see that this text focuses not only on political structures, political parties, but it goes much deeper. It talks about norms, values, and how really Poles should, live their lives. So this is not only about politics, it's also about society. Hence, the idea of political community and political culture, I think, is kind of handy here because it is the two things, right, that kind of come together in this concept. So again, I'm taking a step back. That is the first thing, and I'm looking at the symbolic frameworks that are there. And I think that the key framework here to analyze is obviously Polish nationalism, which is also important from the point of view of gender. Secondly, in the second part of the paper, I'm trying to take a look, again, a little bit, take a step back and look at other anti-gender campaigns in Polish history that were undertaken first in the 20s and then under communism, because we already had that, right? It was, again, not invented by Law and Justice Party. And here I'm specifically looking at how communist politics use this gender issues and how in the 20s, the debates, what kind of conflicts were present there. And in both cases, it is clear that these gender aspects were used to foster political legitimacy of those who were using these discourses, and successfully. And the last element is then I'm trying to map out these key concepts that they are using, Law and Justice is using in the debate. And then the final element that I'm doing is that I'm analyzing how these elements function within the debate, the most recent debate on the Istanbul Convention. And the reason why the Istanbul Convention discussion or debate is so important to Law and Justice is that they also have, that this is kind of, the Law and Justice, the Istanbul Convention clearly stipulates that it demands from the governments that are signatories of it to remodel or reshape how gender issues, how women's position in society is viewed, and attack everything, all the elements of the educational system, how institutional structures work and so on, which in some way kind of substantiate the standpoint that there is this inferiority of women, right? So that's what is expected in the document, and that what governments should actually do. And that is a problem from the point of view of Law and Justice, because they also have a social project, a project to change society, but it is in a stark competition, obviously, to this idea of equality, right? So, and they have a different idea how to restructure society, and obviously this is not around the equal status of men and women. That is not something that they want to endorse. And this is why they attack it. It is not so much the question of violence, although we can say that that there is, in a recent study published by the ombudsman, Polish ombudsman, 30% of the respondents actually admit that they regularly use violence as a means of solving conflicts within the family. So this is an issue, but it's not. I think that the fact that it sort of undermines this traditional authority is not the biggest problem for Law and Justice. The biggest problem is this restructuring of educational system, of institutional structures and so on. And that's why they want to attack it and find it so problematic. Okay, I think this is just to map out what I kind of touched upon in the paper. And I think I will stop with that, and we can go back to what I said maybe.
Okay, we will for sure. Thank you, Anna. And the third guest on our panel is Robert Schotter, Associate Research Fellow at the Political Science Department of the Central European University. Welcome, Robert. Robert's current research focuses on politics of identity, populism, and political discourse. He also publishes on issues of relations between majority and minority rights, gender politics, and discrimination. Robert has also contributed to our publication with a paper titled "In the Name of the Family, the Populist Turn Against Gender in Hungary." So Robert, could you please give us a little insight into this topic and into your research findings?
Thank you, Adela, for this very kind introductions, and I'm also grateful for being here today. My chapter in this volume is actually in many ways linked to what we have been discussing now. Of course, I look at Hungary, and I hope you can draw some parallels with what we have just heard about the situation in Poland. But in a way, I also try to show why it is so important what Andrea has been telling us about, gender becoming really the center of all these populist developments. And my chapter, again, to start like Anna did, why did I write? It actually starts from a puzzle, right? So our prime minister used to declare that he's really not dealing with women issues. And then 2018 comes and his government basically puts women into the center of the program. And they announce all kind of new legislation that, of course, all aim at promoting women to bear more children and to solve the demographic crisis in Hungary. And I got really interesting, so how did we get from, let me say, an infant gender mainstreaming, because I think Andrea was very right in pointing out that this has been an issue in Hungary and, in Poland and much of Central Europe, if not Western Europe as well. But we actually get from this very infant gender mainstreaming to what I would call family mainstreaming, right? So instead of gender, now the family is in the center. But this is not the only puzzling thing, right, about Orban, because if you look more, Hungary is a secular state, right? So in this sense, it's not Poland. I think official figures would say that 16% of people have any regular contact with the church. But yet again, we have at least a political discourse that promotes religious symbolisms and does strengthen the role of church. The latest is just several schools, and I think even a university has been donated to the church. But at the same time, if you look at Hungary, we all know that Hungary used to be a case of an example of minority accommodation. Because of the Hungarians abroad, of course, but these days it's much more common to see open xenophobia in politics. So I was really interested in how did we get, a country that used to be the most institutionalized democracy in the post-communist group to basically being the fullest in deconstructing democracy. And my argument will be that actually this populist rejection of liberal democracy and the continuous propagation of different crises actually leads to a more and more restrictive definition of who the people are. And along the propagated conservative preferences, religious moralism, nativist preferences, basically all will point towards what I call a state-sponsored anti-gender mobilization. So what I do is actually I examine the political discourse of the Prime Minister, as I said, and I look at all the speeches that he has delivered ever since they came in power in 2010. And why do I look at political discourse? Of course, I look at political discourse because I think, you know, discourse is both about, you know, the policy, but also about, so to say, construction of meaning for the public. So of course you can talk about how it is important to set the agenda, but it's also important to consider the framing, right? What is discussed and how it is discussed. So in this sense, of course, I concentrate, as I said, on these processes of othering, so to say, how do we make sense of the us versus the others? So how the self is constructed vis-a-vis the others. And in order to have a grasp of what Orban is saying, I do some quantitative discourse analysis, but of course I'm much more interested in the frames that he uses. And as I said, I basically look on his speeches up till 2018. And because there used to be an argument in the literature that, you know, populists, once they become the new elite, might moderate their discourse, I thought I also compared, you know, the two government cycles with each other to see whether we see any moderation or not. So I look at all kinds of populist discourse elements, which I will not bore you on, you know, about how the Manichaean world is constructed, or, you know, whether even good manners are attacked or not. And I look at how all these populist elements would interact with these processes of othering. And to be very brief, so my conclusion is that if you look at the first, which is actually the second government of Orban, if you recall, he was already in power, but the first government cycle since 2010, I would say basically it's a government that starts with a crisis, right? That Andrea mentioned as well. It's this financial crisis, which is basically the main topic of all the talks that Orban gives. And the other is also conceived in financial. So in this sense, of course, there's a lot of scapegoating. It is basically the International Monetary Fund, the EU, and foreign banks and multinationals that are responsible for Hungary's difficulties with the financial crisis. And on return, basically Hungary is to stand on its own, but its strong moral standing will have, you know, it out from the economic crisis by adopting quite unorthodox economic reforms. So in this way, basically this period is what I call a standard economic grievance-driven populism. The majority interest is already declared over individual liberties. And this is interesting because this leads to already a different conception of who the good people are, right? And as I said, religion is already portrayed as a source of legitimacy. So basically what we have is Orban promoting the 19th century version of conservatism with some Christian morals, where basically women have no other place that, you know, they are subordinated to men and they are responsible, as Andrea was saying, maintaining the family, taking care of the children and the elderly, and also ensuring the man is happy at home, if we want to take the full picture. So in this sense, this is already a delimitation of you know, who we are, who the good people are, and what the role of women can play there. But then if we look at the second government cycle, so the post-2014 time, we do have the refugee crisis of 2015, which again is picked up by Orban and portrayed as an existential crisis, right? So now migration is the nemesis of the nation. And of course, the other are portrayed accordingly. So the image of the other is now the migrant or the refugee promoting EU, that, you know, Hungary would not accept anybody within its community. So of course you have the denouncement of multiculturalism, and although in Orban's talk from 2010, you didn't really see this cultural ethnic element that much, although of course he did like to talk a lot about this golden age of Hungary. In the second cycle, you do see a strengthening of this cultural element, which is then again coupled with a strengthened rejection of secularism. So in this sense, religion is brought back into public discourse, but it is not only in a religious sense, so to say, but it's hijacked as an identity maker. So it's Christian Europe against basically Islam migrants. And of course, all of this attacks gender and gender mainstreaming, because basically the ethnocultural nation, which is also conceived in a religious sense, produces, so to say, further gender inequality, right? So sanctity of the family is upheld, basically promoting a sexist and a homophobic conception of society. Demographic concerns are, you know, putting the sole responsibility for the survival of the nation on the women. I especially like the quote when Orban talks that, you know, there is a great danger because migrant women seem to be more fertile than Hungarian women. And in this sense, we get to what Andrea was talking about. The gender basically becomes the symbolic glue for all dissatisfaction with liberal globalization, migration, Europeanization. So in this sense, I see that, you know, this continuous crises and the continuous evolution of the discourse that finds more and more enemies of the nation, or newer and newer definitions of the self and newer enemies of the self, basically leads the state organized intolerance. We do not accept anybody. The state also hijacks religion and uses it in this religious moralist or Christian favoritism. And it's also very much anti-Islam. It, again, then all contribute to basically creating this state-sponsored anti-gender agenda or anti-feminism, right? That, you know, women, sexual identity, minorities are dismissed basically in favor of pro-natalist and traditional life conceptions. So in this sense, I think this collection of xenophobic nationalism, maybe an identitarian religion, and the anti-gender mobilization is what we should really see as a populist attack on rational liberal democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for sharing your insights. And now happy to open the debate. I have many questions, and I think that there won't be enough time to ask them all. But more importantly, I would like to give our online audience the opportunity to send the panelists their questions and comments. So please don't hesitate to post your questions directly below the stream of this event on Facebook. And especially if you have questions for Andrea, Petö, who will have to leave us very soon, maybe you won't even manage it, but like if you have a question you really want to ask, send it now. That's why also my first question goes to Andrea. You have been talking about the neoliberal approaches to women's rights, labor and care work being kind of at the root or one of the roots of the anti-gender focus of right-wing populists nowadays in Central and Eastern Europe. Do you see additional specific conditions and reasons that make anti-gender populism flourish in this particular region, without wanting to paint a positive picture of the regimes before '89? On the outcome level, there used to be a lot of progress on goals which were followed also by Western feminist movement, like most of women working in full-time jobs, the state providing daycare for children, etc. So why is this gender backlash so particularly strong in this region, and why do populists gain so much attention and support with these topics?
Thank you very much for this question, and I'm extremely honored that both speakers, Robert and Anna, used our work, Gender as Symbolic Glue, which we did with Esther Kovács and Veronika Grzebelska. I mean, I don't think that anybody can aspire more than her ideas being used and actually given more meaning and content, which happened in the previous two papers. But I would like to, how I would like to respond to this question is actually using two concepts. One is the backlash. I'm actually arguing that this is not a backlash. This is a totally new modus operandi of the illiberal populist regime. And I don't think that the backlash logic is helpful. Because it actually assumes that there was a good old times to which we will go back and then everything will be fine. I mean, it hasn't been fine. So I argued in my introduction that the neoliberalization of Eastern Europe actually, from a gender perspective, turned to be an extremely difficult enterprise, and women paid a very high price for that. So, I mean, this backlash, I don't think that this is a backlash. I'm more inclined to accept it as a kind of new mode of state. And this is my second response, that with Veronika Grzebelska, we wrote a piece about the illiberal state's modus operandi, identifying this new state, which was developed in Eastern Europe as this polypore illiberal state. And before the viewers start Googling what the polypore is, this is this mushroom which lives on the trunk of the tree and uses nothing else than the resources from the trunk of the tree. And this polypore, this kind of mushroom, is not producing anything else than the mushroom itself. And if you listen carefully what Robert was describing in his speech, I mean, you see that there is nothing new in this particular discussion about how the Fidesz government is ruling, but they are using, the appropriating, instrumentalizing the already existing concepts, ideas. And what is new here is actually this modus operandi, how it actually operates. And it operates via three different concepts. One is creating parallel institutions and parallel words and parallel realities on several different layers, including parallel NGO sphere, parallel research institutes, parallel universities. So basically creating another world. So this is their revenge, what Anna was calling this setting the symbolic score. They are setting the symbolic score against the liberal democratic Hungary to create another world where totally different rules apply. The second, how they operate, is this security discourse, which everything becomes an issue of fear, hate, and using this emotional baggage to discuss all these issues. And that explains also how they are using gender as a symbolic glue, namely that they glue these things together in order to project a non-existing enemy, which is what they call gender theory. And the third is familialism. And this familialism is very relevant for this volume, that women are disappearing and they are only a part of the family. And that's what Robert was also discussing, that women are expected to produce children. And answering to your question, namely what is specific in Central Europe, is that this kind of state is only possible because the previous 30 years, the neoliberalization actually weakened the state as a structure, the privatization of the different welfare provisions, and basically contributed to the existing of a very weak state, which left a lot of citizens in a defenseless position, and they have got nowhere to go for help. And but the family and the kinship and this kind of medieval structures were revitalized to make this work. And that is specific. And of course, if you compare it with Latin America, you see lots of similarities, because there you also see that the neoliberalized, the Chicago boys also did their harm there. Consequently, the states are also very weak there. So that's why I mentioned in my introduction that this comparison might be interesting for future discussion, a kind of Latin American, East Central European comparison, because there are so many similarities as far as the gender politics, the weak state, the horrible impact of neoliberalization, and more importantly, ways of resistance are concerned. Thank you. And I'm really sorry that I have to leave, but I have other family obligation, which I forgot at the beginning. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea, for being with us, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so to follow up on it, maybe I would like to ask Robert, but maybe also Anna, because you've been talking about the gender being the symbolic glue, but still, like, for example, in Hungary, as you, Robert, described, Viktor Orban and his government has been choosing different enemies in different legislative periods of his government, like focusing at some point more on like foreign capital and banks, then later on migration and so on. So do you, like both of you, think that that gender and feminism might be an exception in this, like that it will stay one of the enemies right-wing populists will focus on in the both countries, or can you imagine that this topic will be exchanged for whatever comes handy, or is it really a constant which is at the core of the illiberal ideologies?
If I can respond, in the short answer is yes, it will stay, and it is a core. And the longer version would be what I have been trying to demonstrate is that this new modus of operandi, to stay with what Andrea was saying, is that this continuous state of crisis. But this crisis is, you know, some are given, like the 2008 financial crisis, or what you could call the migration crisis in 2015. But at the same time, you know, populists can create their own crises, right? So it's everything is a, so to say, a question of framing. So this new mode of operating under the auspices of a crisis is important here, I think, because in crisis, you can make appeals to the people for accepting, so to say, extraordinary measures or extraordinary powers, right? And the COVID situation is also an excellent example in this sense, which are then used by this populist, but also quite authoritarian leaders, right? To, so to say, gain more power to achieve goals that they have in their mind. So in this sense, even if you look back, that Orban used to be opposed to foreign capital because of the economic hardship that Hungarian people experienced. Part of that discourse that actually rejected diversity would also put gender into the focus of, you know, who are, so to say, the right members of the nation. And the answer is given very precisely and clearly by Orban. It is the women who produce enough children so that Hungary can have a strong labor force, therefore get out of the economic crisis. Then you get into the migration crisis. Again, there's even more, you know, othering, in the sense that the self is again reconceived in narrower and narrower terms. But here again, women only lose out more, right? So they are now responsible for the family as well. And they, so to say, have the sole responsibility to ensure the survival of the ethno-cultural nation. In the sense, now look at it as, you know, the future of Christian Europe is put on the shoulders of women alone. So in this sense, I see gender as a symbolic glue that, you know, it is always part of the discourse that actually rejects plurality. Every time you question the value of plurality or diversity, you basically are mobilizing against gender, because what we have heard about, right? Gender is basically questioning all these traditions and status quos that have been there for a while and might have not been, you know, that much improved in this part of the region even before these populist leaders came in. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna, would you like to?
Yeah, maybe one thing.
Compare it to the situation in Poland. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that again, this is something, an important element I haven't talked about maybe before, but definitely what populism does is also strengthening and creating other hierarchies, right? Because it says, okay, we have political community, and there's, as Robert said, there are certain members of the political community who are the true members because they have the right identity, they make the right choices, they have the right religion, and so on and so forth. So we are, and all the others are kind of set outside of the boundary of political community, and that is creating a hierarchy within social structure. And my contention is that without this creating this hierarchy, and this is why populism is so useful, the illiberal project loses its core message, because its core message is precisely that there are hierarchies and there are better and worse citizens, that, you know, everyone has its place, that there is this hierarchy in which we live. I think that this is the core message of illiberal politics. And this is going to get worse, I think, because, I mean, and again, gender is a perfect instrument to kind of naturalize these hierarchies and say this is a strength, nature, normality, nation, right? That's what is normal, and that is a healthy society. So there's no more perfect tool to kind of strengthen this hierarchical understanding of society and of the world than attacking gender and generally talking about it as a totalitarian ideology, as an ideology to begin with, so something that is mystifying us and so on and so forth. So I think, and the reason why it's going, I think, to get worse is not only because of the crisis, and because definitely there will be more inequality also in terms of economy, but also because of the climate crisis. And I think, and I refer here to the article by Naomi Klein, and I think she puts it quite well in her book On Fire, that basically, in order to tackle the crisis, we will need more cooperation, more equality, and so on and so forth, not less. So the conflict will be kind of, I think it will become worse, because there will be a clash between this, for instance, the New Deal policies, which actually are based on these premises of more redistribution, more equality, more cooperation, instead of hierarchy, competition, and so on and so forth. So I think there will be that definitely will have impact. And so I'm not very optimistic in that sense.
Okay, well, thank you. That's an important point as well. I would like to ask, because we were also discussing, or Andrea was highlighting it a lot, also the economy, like the neoliberal structure of the economy, not only in Europe, of course, and economic inequalities existing within the societies, that of course leading to more support for populists, and also on the other hand the disillusion of liberal elites who haven't really managed so far to resolve these inequalities. So how do both of you like see the importance of this issue for like, yeah, the current populism, and how would you assess the attempts of the opponents of right-wing populists in solving these problems? Like, do you see any hope that maybe, yeah, by tackling these issues, there might be other forces like offering those people who really are in need and who are struggling to maybe turn somewhere else, and these are women, of course, very often, because of like, yeah, poorly paid care jobs and so on. So in the pandemic, this issue became even more urgent, I think. So yeah, Anna or Robert, I don't know who of you maybe you would like to comment on this.
Just maybe give a more positive response. From the COVID crisis, I would very much hope actually that women mobilization will get strengthened. But maybe I'm just an idealist, so I don't know, but I would be very curious to hear what Anna thinks about this. But going back to the original question, of course, there is an important part, you know, about the claim of, you know, the losers of transition, and that many people have experienced extreme difficulties with these neoliberal reforms that were adopted in the region. But at the same time, I think it's not important not to forget that many people have been actually disillusioned by the democratic institutions themselves, and felt that, you know, they do not have a voice anymore about politics or deciding their life future in general. So much of the appeal comes from here as well, I think. And just look at Hungary, you know, after 2006, basically Hungary is in a political crisis, an economic crisis, whatever you want to call it. It's everything is basically under the question mark. So of course it is important, but what can you do, right? So you cannot improve or change conditions immediately. But I think it's very important that political forces trying to counter populism actually stay away from adopting the same populist techniques or strategies that the far-right populist parties have been most successful at using it. Because once you get into this game, I don't think there's an easy way out. I think alternatives should be offered to the people instead of going down this chain, which I tried to show actually that there's no end to this, you know. So the good people in the end will be only the party members, or maybe the party leader himself being the Caesar who can basically rule without people at all.
Well, what I could add to it is that I would not underestimate the symbolic normative cultural aspect. I mean, it's not only about economy, really. I mean, when PiS came to power in 2015, the difference between in the average pay in Poland between 2006 and 2015 was like 50%, right? So it was a 50% rise of the average pension for a person, and still pay, I mean, the monthly pay, the monthly check that they would get, and they still won. So it's not only a question of economy, it's also a question of all the symbolic aspects that come with economic redistribution. That's what I said before, that that's why I find this concept of relative deprivation describes this much better. It's not that we are in a terribly bad situation, right? No, we just want to regain our state and make it even better for us, right? And for us, that means the true people, the true kind of subject inhabitants of the state versus those others. It can be the liberal elites or feminists or whoever that is on the other side, but this is our state now, and we are making the rules, right? And we want to improve our situation even more, but it wasn't the, you know, so that the economic situation, Poland actually, the countries that almost didn't suffer after the 2008 crisis. So economic factor was not the factor that decided that PiS won the election. They won the election more because of the Smolensk plane crash and the reaction of the symbolic elite to what has happened. So the symbolic of the reaction of the elite to how people mourned, what happened after then, and the whole discourse that developed around it. When and that was a discussion about who we are really, about identity more than about economy. It was also a discussion about who should own the state, right? Symbolically, but also in its material and institutional structures. So I think that we need to find a balance between these two issues, and do not say, okay, let's do more economic redistribution, that will solve the problem. It won't. That is the problem. That more symbolic, I mean, of course, it's always good to have a more equal society economically, but that will not solve the issue that we have on our plate here. It's a much more complex problem, as I see it. So it's not just about getting, as some people say, this Kindergeld, the Polish version of it, the 500 plus, the so-called. It's not only that, right? It's all the symbolic aspects that come with it. That's what's important. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. So taking the symbolic dimension and identity politics and also the economic and redistributive dimension, I think also very importantly the ownership of the state, as you mentioned. But okay, given these are the roots, what strategies have progressive actors in your countries, political parties, NGOs, grassroots, and etc., used so far in order to respond to the attacks on gender equality, feminism, LGBTQI, and how successful have they been with it so far? For example, like education is one of the strategies. Like many say, okay, we need more education. We need to explain what the term gender actually means, because it's being misinterpreted very often. We need more fact-based arguments, myth-busting, and so far. Do you think, for example, this is a way hasn't been effective, or do you see other strategies which have or haven't been successful? Maybe.
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah. Well, the problem is, well, we have a problem with that really, because what happened, I mean, the last few years really, but it started after the first election of PiS, is that basically the whole NGO sector that used to do the gender work, let's say, got defunded basically. So the problem is that there are no institutions that can actually do it, and it's not part of the curriculum. So obviously a reform of the curriculum would be a key here. And we can even, I'm hopeful in the sense that when you look at the latest protest in Poland, like, I don't know the numbers really, but from what you see when you look at it, like 60, 70, maybe 80% of those people who went to the protests were young people. So I think they see, and that's where I see the light really in a generational change, let's say. But again, it's not such a simple thing, because the Polish curriculum reproduces exactly what I was writing or analyzing in my paper, and the way history is taught, the way other subjects in Polish schools are taught, they are reproducing these key elements of Polish nationalism, which is militarism, or the kind of praise of militarism, praise of heroism, and this idea of self-determination as a function of power and control over others. These are these three elements that are key within the structures of Polish nationalism that are being reproduced within the school curriculum. So I don't really see that much hope in the education as it is at the current moment, because I think it's precisely doing it. I mean, it's contributing to the problem really. And there were fights and struggles over the system of education from the early 90s. And people were trying to, many people were trying to change that, but it didn't work really, because obviously there are people who want to defend that sort of thinking, that sort of symbolic framework, people who identify with it. So it's not that easy that you can really change it, you know, like without a huge social debate, which probably at this moment would probably end very soon, I think. And so it's more complicated than that. Most of the work is being done by NGOs. And again, there is a problem with it as well, because NGOs are kind of blocked out of schools at the moment. So if an NGO wants to go into a school and have some sort of engagement, then there are blacklists of NGOs which cannot really enter schools in Poland at the moment. So even here, I would say we see many problems, and that will not be an easy fight, I would say. But definitely education is the key. The question how to change the educational system is the problem.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, formal education is the one side, but also like, I don't know, I have the comparison with like working on migration issues previously, and then like using experts and arguments like fact-based, fact-checked, also like doesn't always help or is not enough, because people also have the feeling that like, yeah, someone wants to show us that they're smarter and they have like they're right, but we think we are actually right, because it depends on how you choose your sources. And so that was also kind of would be also interesting. Like one thing is this formal education, which thank you for explaining that it's like kind of blocked currently in Poland to change and to enter as NGOs or other progressive actors. But yeah, also this part of like, it's maybe, let's not call it education, but like explaining the issue or informing, awareness raising among the society. If you see it's effective or not.
I could also add that this is polarized. So we are living, I mean, Poles live in these bubbles and they never speak to each other. So even trying to reinvigorate the public debate is very difficult, because there are no channels where people could really meet. So I think that is also an obstacle here, that even if you want to have a discussion, you will always end up in your bubble, right, in your circle, and you will speak to those, you know, who are either already convinced and agree with you, or you will speak to people who will not want to listen to you. So this is really difficult. So generally, a collapse of any sort of dialogue or conversation that is encompassing both camps, I would say, is another problem here.
Okay, thank you, Robert.
No, this is why I said earlier that I very much hope that actually the opposition and alternative actors can actually mobilize against populist actors. Anna is right, you know, so in these states when populist actors dominate the state machinery, they have taken over the public media sector or even some of the private media sector. The force of this message that is sent, this populist message is really difficult to oppose. After all, you know, in Hungary, the study of gender studies is now prohibited, right? So there's no university any longer where you can study this because the claim was who would hire a genderologist, right? So in this sense, my recommendation would be actually that, you know, people might be sitting in their bubbles, but you need to confront them. As difficult it might be, as unpleasant it might be, or as costly it might be, I think you need to confront this, because as I said, this discourse is about ideational factors. It's not about, you know, what is right or what is in the material sense, but it is about what we believe is right or who declares it is right. And this is why I think that, yes, education is very important, but, you know, mobilization, activism, confrontation, presenting the alternative is very important. I would say it's not by chance that, you know, Orban, Kaczynski, they are all trying to control media, right? It is basically for this purpose that the message can go unchallenged. Thank you.
Thank you. We will have a question from the audience soon, but maybe I would like to ask some like I don't want to close yet because we still have a few minutes and we still have some question from the audience. So maybe to address another issue, like we've been mentioning the Istanbul Convention, and violence against women is a very serious issue, which is even more alarming now during the pandemic. And none of the Visegrad countries has ratified it so far. The deniers say that it promotes the so-called gender ideology. Why did they decide to attack particularly this convention? I mean, it's partly logical within their ideology, but still it's a document which like mostly focuses on gender-based violence, which like who could be against fighting gender-based violence? So why did the government choose it as such a big enemy in the both countries? Or you don't have to speak both, but if any of you has a reaction to that, maybe Anna?
Yes, well, I said, I mean, I've been touching upon these points, and I think that is basically what I mean. I don't think that I would have to add anything to that, but the fact that it is about education. So what the Istanbul Convention requires governments to do is to educate, to change the mindset, and to change the family structure, right? So this is something that peace doesn't want to allow, or the Land Justice Party doesn't want to allow. That's precisely, so what they are scared of is the social modernization, right? That's what is kind of frightening. It's not really so much, I think, about the violence. It's about the fact that gender discrimination is defined as a form of violence, that there is this idea that, you know, women are not inferior, right? And that is the problem, because that subverts the message that peace is sending out, right? That we live in a hierarchy, that there is a hierarchy in a family. We have the father, who's the traditional authority, and so on and so forth. So even if he from time to time becomes violent, what's the problem really, right? So so this is typical discourse of and if you could, you know, when you read the same transcripts of this debate that took place in Polish parliament, these are exactly the arguments that were raised, for instance, that destroys Polish, I quote, Polish civilization, Polish culture, Polish traditions, and so on and so forth. So we don't want to have that. And that were also arguments that were kind of raised by women as well. So they also served to kind of strengthen the arguments and kind of give legitimacy to these claims that this is really something that is destroying traditional Polish society. And we don't want this, right? So, and we want to accept these traditional authority structures. That's something that we identify with, at least those who are attacking the convention, especially women. So I think that I wouldn't have anything more, I think, to add why why is this so problematic to Land Justice Party. And obviously that gives also some kind of vivid political points when they attack it, right? So to their voters and for the voters. So I think that's the main reason.
Is it similar in Hungary?
I would say, you know, just following up on Anna, not to repeat what she said, that the Istanbul Convention is just a perfect example of this gender theory, right? That somehow somebody is trying to impose on us this gender, which is not part of our culture and tradition and so on. So in this sense, it's basically a symbolic fight, right? It is, I don't think it would have had any difficulties was it not in this time. And originally countries had no issues with it, right? So, and the text was written up and so, but in the meantime, if you have this, you know, deep state version of, you know, now the EU and everybody is promoting gender and who is gonna say who's a father and who's a mother, and you cannot do this to us in Poland and in Hungary. So in this sense, it is exactly this symbolic glue, I think, that, you know, we are opposed to giving up our sovereignty in our, let's say, culture, although I wouldn't say this is a cultural issue. So in a sense, I think it's really much more about the symbolic value than what it is written in the convention. Thank
you very much. Now we have a question from Vladimir Handel from the Charles University, Prague, and he writes, "Thank you for this great debate. My question would be whether the polarization does not manifest also in the creative culture, literature, film, music. Polish and Hungarian culture used to be seen in the Czech Republic as very liberal in the past. So how do you see that?"
In Hungary, it's very clear that there is a polarization, and you must know already, right? There was a huge scandal with a new board named for the University of Film and Theater, and there was a student protest where they occupied the university that dragged on for a while. And the result, of course, is that the state had its way. So the Fidesz had instituted a new governing body, or I don't even know, it's, I think, a university board that is now heading the state film and theater university. And all those that thought otherwise have found it, so to say, an independent school that actually can operate only with the help of all kinds of, you know, European universities that have agreed to accept a few students in their study program so they can actually graduate with credits, right? So this, I think, would say everything about polarization, but just I mean, further on this, of course, all the public funding is earmarked. So if you don't fit our requirements, you are out. So basically you cannot survive, and this reaches every aspect of the arts. And it is exactly in the arts, and maybe even pop music, for example, where you can see mobilization against populism, which can be successful. So some of this, you know, even pop art can be quite useful at pointing out how ridiculous occasionally some of these public messages are. But I'll stop here so Anna can also say her opinion.
Well, it's the same in Poland. Maybe the difference is that it's not as bad because there are still some independent theaters, some independent institutions, but definitely there is this, you know, this fully fledged war to take over, right? To take over theaters, to take over smaller institutions, you know, local theaters, local community centers that do some cultural projects and so on and so forth, and to control that, obviously. So we had many controversial decisions when it comes that came from the Ministry of Culture about who should run which institutions, and that obviously sparked a lot of protests and a lot of clash, especially the National Museum last year. That was particularly bad, but it was not the only. That was not the only, I would say, problem. So yeah, but again, and there's also a polarization between left art and right art right now. So there are institutions that work sort of, you know, against each other as well. So there is a polarization, and there's this kind of clash also, and the takeover of state-funded cultural institutions by nominees, official nominees from the Ministry of Culture, which is the law and justice candidates that are not always, or typically they're very controversial. So there is, I think the situation is pretty much the same here.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to stop on a positive note, but we are also running out of time. And I just wanted to ask, maybe you can have a very short reaction to it. Like, could you imagine any positive, let's call it a positive version of populism? I mean, Andrea referred to feminism also as to something which could be seen as a sort of populism, and which could help, let's say, make the progressive, egalitarian, inclusive politics great again. And how could that look like? It's a very complex question, maybe, but maybe if there is like one idea, one strategy, one thing maybe you've seen that has been in place and has worked or could work, I'll be glad.
Originally, populism can be, you know, emancipating or empowering as well. And this could go in different type of formats, from popular initiatives, the consultations, direct voting systems. I'm not sure which would be realistic, but I think, you know, for example, consultation systems could work, not in the way, of course, Fidesz uses, that, you know, they ask all kind of questions and they never report on the responses, but claim legitimacy based on these responses. But I think this could only work in the sense that if you want to empower the people, that these basic premises of liberalism, which is basically that the individual human worth is not challenged for anybody, be that, you know, a migrant, socialist, or an international actor, or an intellectual, or a secular, or a gay person, it would not work otherwise. So I think you need to have plurality and acceptance of diversity before you can think of how you could empower the people. I'm not sure this goes with populism.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I think that what I maybe my hope, let's say, is that the climate crisis will help us to generate new concepts and new ideas. That is something that we haven't heard or haven't used so far, and that will help us to somehow consolidate the public around this more egalitarian social project. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm a fan of this term Green New Deal, but definitely something along the lines, I guess that might be a platform that could at least kind of give us a hope of finding a new political language or a new political idiom, or to kind of, work with our political imagination to invite new concepts and new ideas. I hope, but obviously but if I see any kind of hope, then I would point in that direction. But obviously this is my wishful thinking, whether that could be effective. Well, that's probably to be seen.
Yeah, I think that's what we all do need, a bit of wishful thinking and hope and kind of a vision of how it could be better to not only react to what we are afraid of or what we see as a problem and as a danger. So thank you for that. And thank you to all of you, also Andrea, who's already gone, for sharing your original, critical and very enlightening insights with all of us. I also hope that this debate has sparked the interest of those who listened to delve a bit deeper into the subject of populism and gender. For that purpose, I also can only recommend our book once again, which you can download from the website of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Prague. And since this is the last event of the whole 3 days conference, I'd like to give the word to Mejstřík for a very short, let's say, goodbye words or wrap up.
Thank you, Adela, very much. Yeah, I will be very brief. I would just want to thank all of the participants, all the speakers, discussants, chairs. Also, I would like to thank to all the team who made possible this conference, these extraordinary times. So from Goethe Institute, from Heinrich-Böll Foundation, also from our institution. It went quite well. I'm very happy that we managed to do it without any obstacle and give you during these 2.5 days very interesting inputs and insights in the current development of populism in Europe from very various angles. And I would like to say that I'm very happy that we managed to organize this year, even in these very difficult circumstances. However, I will hope that next time for the 7th edition of our conference, we will be able to meet again and to go, as always, to drink a beer after the end of the conference to some very nice place in Prague with the sunny weather which we have now. So I hope that we will manage it next year, and that would be the last word from this conference today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and let's hope that this will work latest in the next year. So
thank you, everybody.
And thank to all of you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.